So just a quick recap of Monday's notes on 2.1. A few takeaways you should have from that is number one, you should know how to find the next couple of numbers in a sequence of numbers that have a pattern. You should know what it means to find a counterexample, which is to find one thing for which a conjecture is not true. And then you need to remember that a conjecture is an observation that you make based on a pattern that you see. So just to put that all into one statement, if I were to see that every time I square a number, it seems to be odd, and I square 3 and it's odd, then I pick another number, maybe 7, and I square it, and it's still odd. And if I were to make a conjecture based on that when you square a number, you will get an odd number. That's my conjecture based on what I've seen. A counterexample would be one number that I can square that's not odd. And all you need is one of them to make the conjecture false. Sometimes there's a lot of them, which means your conjecture was really bad. Sometimes there is only one, which means close, but out of luck. All right, so conditional statements are also sometimes called if-then statements. And a lot of times we'll say just, that they're if-then statements like this. We're going to have some symbols in here because you're going to notice that there's a lot of writing with these. So the symbols just help cut down on the amount of things that we need to write. So a lot of times the P is what we call the if part of the sentence, and we'll call Q the then part of the sentence. So for example, when I say if I am hungry, I would call this P, and it's actually called the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is actually the if part, or what follows the if. So my hypothesis up here is that I am hungry. I have to go for a big sandwich. The conclusion up here is what comes after the then. So I'm going to go then, dot, dot, dot. Conclusion. So up here, my conclusion, which I could also call Q, if I don't want to write the whole thing out, would be I eat. So I'm going to repeat that real quickly. So a conditional statement is of the form, or can be written of the form, if P, then Q. The if part is the hypothesis. The then part is called the conclusion. And then a lot of times with the notation, we'll say P implies Q. Basically, that means if P, then Q. All right. So I have this same conditional statement written a little differently. I wrote, I eat when I am hungry. Now, you don't see an if or a then in that statement, but I want you on the side to write this. When you see the word when, this would be really note card worthy, so maybe we should highlight that. So, I suggest you have highlighters out, and I have certain terms highlighted up here, but I will also put some others on there. So, when you see the word when, I want you to think of the word if. Okay? So, I'm going to write the word if above this, and you follow the if. Okay? So when equals if, and we follow the if when we rewrite this. So again, I told you this guy up here and this guy up here look differently, but they're actually the exact same conditional statement. So I'm going to do a rewrite on that and say, if I am hungry, then I eat. And again, if you need to pause the video and catch up with the writing, that's just fine. The hypothesis of this is, again, what comes after the if, let's just point right there. The I am hungry, try to save some writing. And again, the conclusion is the I eat. So both of those statements, again, I'm going to grab my highlighter here. So both of the statements in green are exactly the same conditional statements. They have the same hypothesis and the same conclusion. So if I were to say, I cry when I am sad, that's the same as me saying, I cry if I am sad. So if then would be, if I am sad, then I cry. And again, that's it. You need to replace the when with the if, and then you can identify your hypothesis and your conclusions. All right, so let's go to the next page, which is called truth value and counterexample. So again, you might want to highlight this, but a truth value is just basically true or false is what we want to know. And we talked about a counterexample already, that it's that one thing that proves something false. We did that yesterday. I rewrote it down here. Again, might be no card worthy. So let's go read my conditional statement, which is in if-then form. If an angle is acute, you should already know that we can replace that with the symbol P. We call it the hypothesis. Then it measures 30 degrees. We would call that Q or the conclusion. Truth value just means, is this statement true or false? So is it true that if an angle is acute, I get to say, yep, it's 30 degrees? Well, that's kind of ridiculous. That's false, right? If an angle is acute, all I know is that it's less than 90. It doesn't mean it has to be 30. So when it says come up with a counterexample, I need something that meets the if part. So I need an acute angle that's not 30 degrees. There's so many. That's such a poor conjecture, right? Or if-then statement. 40 degrees, 55 degrees. There's a lot of counterexamples, but when you're asked for one, you really only need to list one of them. All right, so let's move along to the bottom here. So the next step, we're going to talk about a converse, inverse, and contrapositive. And you'll notice that I highlighted them over here. And you should as well. It's telling yourself you better I would put this whole chart on a note card. So I told you that a conditional statement is a statement that is in if-then form or can be in if-then form. And I'm going to go on the side here. Don't write this. But again, if I said, I cry when I am sad, don't write that down. Just kind of look at it. That's actually a conditional statement. I'm going to replace the when with the if, and I'm going to head straight on forward. And I would write it as, if I am sad, then I cry. Okay? So, this again would be considered the P, or the hypothesis, and this I cry would be what happens at the end of the situation. After I'm sad, I start crying. It's my conclusion. All right? But I didn't see the if in the original statement. I told you to replace the word when with if. I'm going to tell you the exact same thing for all. So also, I think you should write all equals if. And I think you should take out your highlighter and highlight that, meaning it's note card worthy. So I'm going to replace this with if. Now that doesn't make sense to say if squares have 4 sides. It says all squares have 4 sides. So we need a subject if what has 4 sides. Okay? So it says all squares have 4 sides. So we'd say if a square, that sounds a little awkward, but it's okay. But I like to have a subject. So I'm going to say if a shape or a polygon or a geometric figure, okay, if a shape has 4 sides. Oh, I'm sorry. If a shape, I'm super sorry, is a square, right? So if a shape is a square, so basically if square, then it has 4 sides. It has 4 sides. hard to write, kind of too, depending on how good your English and your grammar is. So a lot of times we test these multiple choice so that if you know it's supposed to say, okay, if the thing's a square, then it has four sides, but you don't quite know how to get a subject into your sentence, it really won't affect it in the end. That's more of a task for your English class. But every sentence should have a subject. So I shouldn't say, if square, then four sides. I should say, if a shape is a square, then it has four sides. All right? That would be called my conditional statement, my if, then. And if I were to write it, I would say P implies Q. Okay? So P is, shape's a square. Q is, it has four sides. Its truth value would be true. Because if a shape is a square, all squares have four sides. So that's good. So now we're going to talk about, well, what's a converse? So what a converse does is, I call it the swapper. If you write that on a note card, that'll help. What we do is we just swap the if with the then. We reverse the if and the then. So we would say if, and then we say a shape, but we won't say is a square, we'd say has four sides. So we're basically reversing or swapping the if and the then. So if a shape has four sides, then it is a square. And again, if I'm writing too fast, you just go ahead and pause the video. So up here, my original statement is of the form if P, then Q. When I swap them, it becomes notationally Q implies P. Okay? It's truth value. So I have to go back and see if this is true. If a shape has four sides, am I 100% sure it's a square? It's a rectangle, or a rhombus, or a kite, or a trapezoid, but it doesn't have to be a square. All right, so the inverse of a conditional statement, I like to call it the nodder. I've got the swapper and the not. Basically, what you do is you go back to the original. So you're going to point an arrow out here, up here, and you insert the word not into both the if and the then statements. So I'd say if a shape is not a square, then it does not have four sides. So if a shape is not a square, then it does not have four sides. You can see why I call it the nodder. I've got the swapper, and I've got the nodder. Okay? So our original was P implies Q, which means we need a symbol that means not P and not Q. And that symbol is a little squeal. Weird, right? I told you this stuff is a little weird. But I want to point at that. That means not P implies not Q. For this statement, let's see that its truth value. If a shape is not a square, so I'm thinking of shapes that aren't squares, then am I 100% sure that it doesn't have four sides? And again, that's false. There are shapes that are not squares, right? So it says if a shape is not a square, let's make one. How about this kite or diamond-y shape? Then it does not have four sides. Well, this has four sides. So again, when you find one counterexample, you say it's false. Now, the contrapositive does both those things. I call it the swapper nodder. Right? So we swap, which means we reverse the if and the then, and we not. And again, you always go back to that original. So I'm going to go, you put a big old star up here. I am going to swap them. So I'm going to talk about the four sides first. And I'm also going to negate to put the word not. So that would become if. You can see why we're not doing a lot of examples of this. You're going to practice in Delta Math, so you don't have to write a ton to get the concept down. Thank you, Mrs. Arun. You are welcome. So if a shape And I'm going to go swap them, so I'm going to talk about the four sides, because that's at the end, and put it up front. But I'm going to say it does not. So that's why I call it the swapper number. If a shape does not have four sides, comma, then it is not a square. So I'm going to repeat here what we have our original if-then statement. If this, then that. The swapper does if that, then this. It just reverses them. The notter negates them. If not this, then not that. The swap and notter does both. If not that, then not this. You can probably guess at what the symbols would be. I challenge yourself to do it. We need to swap the if and the then, the p and the q, and negate them. Let's determine this truth value. If I know a shape doesn't have four sides, I don't know how many it has, but I know it does not have four, then am I 100% sure it's not a square? Definitely. There's no way I can have a square that doesn't have four sides. So that's the end of your notes, but gotta make sure you have this down. I don't want you to practice a lot in your notes. You can see why. It's words galore, right? But I want to make sure you understand the difference between these three. So have your notes out, and you're going to go to Delta Math, and you are going to see in there that there is a 2.2 mastery. So there'll be 5 questions just for me to make sure that I give you enough to get that vocabulary down without making you write 10,000 sentences. So once that's at a mastery in a 5 out of 5, you'll raise your hand, or I guess if you are at home because you missed class, you will print off the 2.2 worksheet, and that's your actual assignment. It's a short one, so no worries there. All right, so Delta Math Mastery could take you anywhere from 2 minutes to hopefully no more than 10, and then the worksheet for homework. Peace out, girls.